This is Fraser Sturt, Professor of Archaeology at the University of Southampton. We're moving into very different territory now. Among his many talents and research interests, which include maritime prehistory, geoarchaeology and pastry making, which Dan can vouch for, I think. Yeah. He's currently collaborating with Historic England on the AHRC-funded Unpath'd Waters marine and maritime collections in the UK project. And this is part of a much larger Towards a National Collection project, which is an £18.9 million project investment, which it aims to use digital technology to unify national collections from the UK's museums, libraries, galleries and archives. So you may well have heard of this before, but I will leave it up to Fraser to tell you more.
And I will try and be brief, because like lots of people in here, it could feel a bit like Archaeologists Anonymous in terms of how have we ended up in the mess we are, and we can be a little bit hard on ourselves. Actually, there's lots of positives, and we can understand why we're in the situation we are, and there are things that can happen. I will say there's lots of people working on this, so all the good stuff is theirs, and any errors are mine. What Unpath'd Waters is doing is a really ambitious thing. It's looking at UK territorial waters. That's 3.5 times the area that is the landmass of the UK, and also including the landmass as well, because we're looking at marine and maritime records, and obviously traces of that activity extend onshore as well as they do offshore. So it's a big thing covering a large area. There, if you don't know them, those are our territorial waters. And the reason why this is really important is there's a lot of stuff. If you don't work in the sea, you may not be aware of how much stuff there is in the sea. Our global commitments to meet net zero by 2050 is going to fill huge areas of this. We've got a paper coming out in terms of what the actual physical footprint of this in terms of current turbines will be. We've got a range of pipelines, interconnectors, a lot of oil and gas still going on and will be going on into the future. And our ability to understand the impact of that, enable the planning process, but also to do the archaeology of that area justice, requires us to be able to access the archive of information that we've built up so we can understand it over the last hundreds of years. And that, as we all know, is a lot harder than it should be, which makes the process of doing this really both challenging and at times compromised. So there's a big push to think about how we can tie things together. And then that's why this is part of the Towards a National Collection project by UKRI, which recognises we've generated huge numbers of archives and data sets which are discrete, separate and decidedly unfair in that findable, accessible, interoperable and reusable sense of the word. And that, as Sarah was saying, is a huge loss to us, both in terms of knowledge, because it's not just about data, it's how we transform that into knowledge, but also in terms of actually having to redo things when at times we might not. If you're someone like me who likes to think about sea level change and response to that, the fact that I can't easily find dated cores or even references to peat within EIA documents is really peculiar. This is a data set of international significance.
There are white scales in Dover, White, Portland, Plymouth and South East Iceland.
So hopefully, on this talk, I just wanted to pick out on this slide, well, the shipping forecast, that the records relating to maritime activity are really varied. And we're deliberately looking at intangible as well as tangible, physical archives, digital archives, material culture, artistic response, sonar, etc. It's incredibly ambitious. Good. It does go. So what are we trying to do? It's been split up into a range of teams, sort of project ideals and objectives, and Barney Sloan deserves a medal for bringing this together at English Heritage, or Historic England, sorry. And we're looking at how we can integrate the UK's marine and maritime collections. There's a really key question about that, bringing things together. And then recognising that bringing things together doesn't make them actually usable at times. It's relatively straightforward at times to put things in one place. But actually, how do we want to extract information for them? And that's where so ADS are leading on step one. We're leading on discovery about tools we can use to surface information. And then we've got a variety of research lenses which are looking at those in specific case studies, before then going through how we look at co-design and co-creation to allow people to engage. So this is a little bit of the difference with the rewilding here, is we're then trying to think about what are the user groups and how do we get beyond a relatively exclusive group of people wanting to access this, to make this much more widely findable and usable. And then how do we judge if that actually has worked and did people like it? So it is a big thing. It falls out into these different work packages, and they're working in 3 different phases because it is quite challenging. We had a first year where we had an incubator lab, which is where we just got stuff in and tried to work out where some of the problems were. We're now in phase 2, which is looking at innovation, going, okay, so now we've identified the problems, what can we do to address them? Because we're very clear in the application that we might not be able to fix all of these things. And then the final year will be going into actually delivery of some of these things. And I should put an important caveat here. This is what the UKRI are calling a demonstrator project. This is not, in some respects, sadly, designed to create the solution that will exist for perpetuity. It's about exploring options and models which could be rolled out in different ways. And that's why one of the things that we've begun to measure, particularly in the work package I'm working on, is where is the knowledge gain? So if we're putting in this effort, what's been the return? Because there's lots of things that we can do, which all look very shiny and clever, but not all of them actually generate a sort of transformative shift in knowledge. So where is sort of time and money best spent? As you'd imagine, to do this, it requires a lot of different partners and organisations. So it's all of the UK heritage agencies, 9 universities, and then an increasing array of collaborating organisations and project partners who are genuinely putting a lot of effort into this because everyone recognises the gain to be had. There are challenges that were identified, and this is going to speak to lots of what's come before. Working with the national heritage datasets, they're differently structured, using different systems, with different histories of use and purpose, by different people, as well as a really critical part of this, in terms of how they've chosen to create their information. There's a vast range of associated datasets. Some of them are fair, but most are not. And we've got a massive problem in terms of absence of metadata occurring. There's big changes in practice in terms of terminology, what words mean, what fields mean, what archaeologists understood by different terms of data at the time they created them, and where things are stored. We've got a big issue with the air gap in terms of sometimes we might have metadata, but what people really want is the data for that to drive, allow people to do the analysis they want. And we have a huge issue about the lack of standardisation and reporting and requirements, both in academic and commercial research. That's not because of a lack of standards. We've got really good standards out there and good guidance practices. It's just they're not always followed. So these are challenges. In terms of the work and how it's moving out, we've had data audit and data collation led by the ADS, which involved creating, and this is a topic of lots of discussions, it may be by others in the room, around the use of ontologies. We need to use ontologies to help us map data. But when you move into the area that we're working on, we don't like ontologies because ontologies constrain understanding. So it's a list of agreed terms that archaeologists have created, a bit like Soma was saying, which are historically situated and also potentially problematic, which are then used to drive online search and discovery. This is how the internet works, okay? Everyone, for a long time, people were trying to get away from that using semantic search technologies to allow you to use any search term you like. Okay? And there is a friction there, which we're playing with. So we're trying to find other ways, when you come into enhancement and aggregation, around how we can overcome some of those challenges and then feed those through. In terms of how it's actually working, this is very standard, I'm glad you're happy there, Tim. I did wonder about what slides do you include, and I like Julie for this one. This is pretty much how things work. I can show you that's how we're working, and if you go to current publications on this, it's remarkably similar, in that everyone goes, oh, it sounds very fancy, but really we've got data over here in spreadsheet form, we try and work out what people are saying and map them onto an ontology so they're comparable. We then think about how we can put that in one place to make it discoverable, which is what's going on here. And then we realise there are issues because although we've mapped them, not all of the data sets include all of the terms. And a good one, and people won't mind me saying this, in the Welsh data set we have, for example, when you're looking at shipwrecks, it just says wreck. It doesn't tell you what sort of vessel it was or anything like that. Whereas in other data sets, we might get, it's a schooner. So these things aren't comparable. It's a data entry, but has a lot of meaning. So what can we do to address this? He says quickly. Oh, firstly, I should say, you've got to be happy with any gain. For the first time ever, which I find utterly unbelievable, through the work the ADS have done in just aggregating this material, we can now look at the distribution of wrecks at a national level. okay, across all 4 countries. We never knew what the distribution of schooners was before, okay? We could not look at a variety of wrecking events and these things. It just was not possible, although the data was theoretically fair. And now, through a portal that's been produced, you can do this. And that is genuinely changing knowledge levels and creating new research questions. So although putting things together feels small, the gain is high. Now, because of that data variability, it could be improved. So we've been working with, to use the terms, the ADS has put this through into a nice a graph database, which can be an RDF triple store, which we can access to query, okay, and apply different AI, artificial intelligence, and machine learning techniques to begin to query further. Everyone happy? Good, okay. So this will allow us to get over the problem. So if you look here, you can see an example of problems in terminology. So here, the search on particular wreck types, there's a really nice density around the coast of Britain, but there are none in Wales. And we know this is because the data set doesn't include those terms. But that's not really true. It says, moving on. In terms of where we'd like to get to, we'd like to be able to say that because of the qualities of the data sets we're bringing together, we don't need to centralise, we just need to link. So if HES, CADU, Historic England can all agree on terminologies, they can all hold their own data sets, we don't need to duplicate, and we can link officially across them. This is really a lot harder than we'd like it to be because of those issues of data gaps and nomenclature, which where it goes back to what Sarah was talking about in terms of authority files. And in archaeology, that gets a lot more complicated because of who holds what interesting information and how we trace it. So we have units, universities, as Anwen's slide show, everyone holding their own information and cataloguing it slightly differently. So even if you're an expert in this area, actually finding those things is quite difficult. So they might theoretically be open, but they're not very findable. So we have to find ways through this. The other really big challenge that we've seen, which ties into the Welsh data, is working practice. I'm sure everyone's seen and has a lot of examples of this in their own work, which is spreadsheets which have some key information like sample ID, where it's from, and then a notes field. And that notes field has got everything in it of any interest. And we all know you should not do this. This is concatenation of data, and this is really bad practice. And yet, it is just everywhere. And that is a real problem if you're working with metadata as well, because all of your interesting, juicy stuff is here and completely unfindable. You cannot access it. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist and people have done really important work and given you really detailed descriptions which should answer your questions. It means that you cannot find it. And also really critically, if you're doing sort of big data work, a computer cannot see it, okay? So it's not fair, and we can't do the sort of exciting analysis we want to do if we look at the research frameworks, as Tim was saying. We want to know about changes in distribution of field system types or rec types, and that's hidden there. So for example, if we look at this in terms of recs, in terms of one of the things that we're looking at, we've got an idealised workflow that you find something, you record it, you pick out the diagnostic features, and you work through the data sets, and woohoo, you know what it is. The issue is the green things are the things which are fair and we can do. The orange things are sort of open, and the red things are no way, okay, absolutely not accessible. So everywhere you go as a researcher working in this area, you hit a block at the moment that prevents you from actually generating this information. So our hypothetical world of linked data and beautiful computer-led discovery stops, okay, as soon as you've gone from a national data set or an HER. But we can overcome that, okay? And that's what we're working on, is trying to pick off these ones which give you a pathway to greatest change, and then will also enable linkage. And a lot of this is very simple. So just to show you it's not hypothetical, and Julian from Arcam's work might be showing this. This is an exact case of, in the Welsh data set, we're saying we can't find these vessels, but actually when we go into the data, you go, wow, this is amazing. You might have just described this as a wreck, but actually you know it's a wooden bark built in Aylesford in 1872. As an archaeologist, this is what I want, okay? But I don't want to have to read 5,000 records to find it. So this is where we've gone to enrichment. And we've done two approaches like most people in the world at the moment. One is a zero-shot machine approach. This is where you just go, computer, this data has structure, because it's been put together by people who are thinking. So there should be some logic in this that you can work out. Go crazy. Sadly, it will go crazy, and it will want to please you like a puppy, and it will bring back results and go, here it is, I found the answer. And then you've got to work out when it's right and when it's wrong, and that's quite problematic. So we've actually moved on to what's called a few-shot approach now, where you tell it, this, in this data set, is the sort of structure of information. Now go and have a look. And even particularly, this is data that this person created, because it's quite important. This is how they think. So here's an example, and here's another person who might do it slightly differently, who might have been employed by that agency slightly later in time. And that begins to generate significant changes. Because of the nature of terminology in archaeology, we can also use name density recognition to delve into those notes sections, really. So this is when we've decided we want to pick out particular things. So here we're picking out ship types. So we've got a galley, we're picking out dates, and we're also picking out places. So we're interested in narrative construction as well. We want to know people, places, dates, quantities, and shapes. And we can let this run through and extract from this those additional fields. So essentially we can take our concatenated data and spread it out to make it much more interesting to lead to knowledge gain. Because suddenly you can start thinking about particular shipbuilders or places of production. One really interesting thing is if you search any of the national data sets that we've been through, there is no vessel, no wreck associated with slavery or any form of the slave process. It's not in the record at all. However, if you look at the places of construction, where people are going from and to, and the time dates, you begin to re-present this. So there are very important things hidden within these data sets that we can surface. So this is really exciting and works quite nicely. There you go, just another nice example. We can also get into the complexity of archaeological data sets. This is just from the Welsh data, for nearly 6,000 records. For over 1,500 of them, no vessel name is mentioned if you're interested in wrecks. Okay, so we know that's no point in looking any further in that one. We go, that we're going to have to go somewhere else if we want to extract that. For most of the record, though, it's not that complicated. Over 2,000 of them just name a single vessel type. So that's really simple. Our confidence in our ability to pinpoint this is pretty good, okay? But in some situations, we get multiple vessel names. So this might be the tug Anne went to the rescue of the Joanna, okay? And semantically, this begins to get more complicated. And then you get 3, and in some instances, amazingly, over 5 different vessels mentioned. But that's, in some ways, we really like this because this actually ties us to stories. Increasing complexity tells us that something's going on, and so it actually allows us to zone in. We can begin to chunk the data and go, this looks like a really big data problem, but 2,000 of the records we'll put away. We can't do much about that. Over half of it, simple, happy. Ooh, this looks interesting. And that sort of just gives you that cumulative curve to give you a sense of it. So this is about vessel types. Most of the records that we have, so previously we didn't know what was in the Welsh records, but now we know most of them relate to schooners. If you don't know, that's what most vessels are, a UK record, an English record as well. And then we can look down this massive list of different types of vessels and begin to think about what's interesting. Now you see lots of them are 0. This is the problem with authority files. Is we have to create a massive list of all the things that might possibly exist. There's U-boats in here that there might have been one prototype created by, and the computer scientists working here get really upset because it hasn't found any U-boat type U5s. And you're like, we would not expect it to. That is in a museum in X or Y. So there are different senses of domain specialism that are also required to interpret these things as well, because this was causing our colleagues a lot of concern, and it was making us very happy because it was telling us about the nature of the record. We've run it with a variety of different language models as well, but this is one thing I just want to flag in terms of numbers. This is really good, okay? Computer scientists are loving it, but we're getting sort of a max accuracy at times at sort of 83%. So it's a bit like radiocarbon we've got to come back to and go, there's a good percentage of the records where when it comes back like the puppy, it's not right. Now we're fine with that. We can begin to flag that and actually zone in on where this will be the instances where we've got multiple vessels, for example, named, it's picking the wrong one. But if you're a National Heritage Agency that's creating an authoritative record, that is an issue for you. So there are some things here about tools. So we can correct problems in the past to create a better and improved version of the heritage record, and we can identify where the problems may be. But the really critical learning we have to take from this is, how do we stop being in this mess, okay? This is a product of us all having to work too much in slightly fragmented ways, and at times, as someone said, without training. How do we structure data and what use do we want to put it to? So we can overcome some of the problems here by thinking about how we're producing them. I'm conscious of time. So one of the things that we're really interested in this is, how do you measure progress in these sorts of projects? So the aims of what is it you want to get out of generating this. So we can spend a lot of time and effort surfacing every single ship type, but actually have we got far enough, and do we now want to answer a different question? So what sort of knowledge do we want to generate? Well, there's a really important question about what are the unintended consequences of what's happening. Soren mentioned changing understanding through time. A lot of the records that we might be looking at might have been generated 30, 40 years ago and might not reflect understandings or ideas that we want to surface. Okay, so there may be problems in some of the things that we're doing about it. There's also a chance that in bringing things up, you bury other things. So you actually get information loss or knowledge loss with some of this as well, because you just engage everyone in a particular richness or diversity, which might actually be distracting. This sort of comes back to Dan's question and going, what is it that we actually want to know? So what is the quanta in archaeological knowledge, and how fine does it have to be for us to do what we want to do? So I thought I'd just finish up with saying, we don't always need to centralise things if they are truly fair and critically well described. We know that's always going to be problematic, so actually centralisation isn't always a bad thing. So I think that's a good place to come to. I'm becoming much harder in my approach to this. And actually, a lot of this could just be addressed through requirements in reporting. We're very friendly to ourselves in archaeology, going, we'll try very hard as a community to do better. Maybe that's not the approach. Maybe it is actually, if we're going to do preservation by record, this is the minimum requirement. And if you can't do this, you shouldn't be doing it, because this is preventing us as a discipline of moving forward. So if it's going to cost more to do it, we need to be charging more to do it in a commercial sense. It's not appropriate for us not to have proper data plans around this, because this is where the value is, and we know we can't answer our questions about it. So I do think we have to be much, much tougher on this. I think there's a good example of practice in Scotland in terms of DES actually getting people to submit their annual reports about what they did. It's an incredible resource. And we are a small discipline. It's like thinking about us as giant pandas in a way. We have a collective responsibility for ensuring that what we're doing persists and continues, and we don't have these peaks and troughs of knowledge gain and knowledge loss. And that is how we do it, is through making this material meet these minimum standards and supporting each other in delivering that. So there is a training need, but there's also possibly a regulatory need here for people to say, this is what good archaeology looks like. Okay, thank you very much.